On November 18th, 1896, at 4 in the morning along the frozen eastern bluffs of the Cabinet Mountains, an Arctic vortex collapsed temperatures to 37 degrees below zero. Down in the basin, wealthy ranchers in heavy timber estates were burning through entire forests, confident their massive log walls would easily outlast the storm. Up on the exposed granite ridge, Aaron Vance, a surveyor who had buried his wife after a damp cabin freeze 9 months earlier, possessed only a dark limestone cavity and 300 pounds of greasy sheep wool. The entire valley waited for him to come crawling down to beg for shelter. But when the blizzard struck, it was not the cave that broke. While seasoned builders chopped up their dining tables just to keep their children from freezing in their beds, a 9-year-old girl sat deep inside that stone hollow in a light flannel shirt without shivering. What kept 40 tons of freezing granite at 54 degrees without burning a cord of wood was a survival secret the frontier had completely ignored. In late September, when the mountain ash along Blacktail Creek turned brittle and yellow, Aaron Vance made his first climb up the eastern slope. He carried no lumber framing, fiberglass rolls, or steel hardware. He led a pack horse loaded with 300 pounds of raw, unwashed wool fleeces smelling heavily of sheep lanolin. Behind him, 9-year-old Maya carried a coil of heavy hemp rope and a rusted iron pry bar. Their blue heeler mix, Dutch, stopped at the dark fissure split into the hillside. The horse refused to step past the mouth. The animal snorted at the dark recess, planting hooves into shale until Aaron took the halter. Inside, stone swallowed daylight within 10 feet. Down in the basin, life moved with comfortable certainty. Ranch hands on the general store porch watched the strange procession through binoculars. Frank Calloway, who operated the primary timber outfit in the county, leaned against his flatbed truck and spat into the dry dirt. "A cave is where a man drags a wounded calf to wait out a night storm," Calloway said. "It is not where a rational father raises a child through a northern winter." The men on the benches chuckled into their coffee cups. Nobody moved to stop Aaron. Nobody called the sheriff. Most reached a more comfortable conclusion. Grief had broken his common sense. The previous winter had taken Sarah Vance. For 7 years, Aaron lived in the hand-scribed pine cabin he built on the lower meadow. The structure was square, plumb, and chinked with mortar. But when the extended freeze of January hit their ridge, cold timber pulled moisture straight out of the living room air. Condensation beaded along the inner logs, soaking the insulation beneath the subfloor. Sarah developed a wet cough that turned into pneumonia within 10 days. Aaron burned cord after cord of tamarack, keeping the cast-iron stove glowing orange around the clock. The hotter the air became, the faster the freezing walls drew moisture. By late February, Sarah was gone. After the funeral, 3 enamel cups sat on the shelf above the sink. Only 2 were ever touched. Every morning, before Maya woke, Aaron quietly turned the handle of Sarah's cup toward the wall so the child would not see it. He never cursed the weather, and he never blamed the doctor. He examined the logs. He watched the frost line creep under the front sill. He watched the chimney pull cords of heat into the sky while Maya's breath plumed white at dawn. The cabin had failed. He refused to trust it twice. One evening, he opened his black surveyor ledger and wrote 3 words on a clean page: moisture. Wind, mass finding an answer meant abandoning everything the basin builders considered common sense. The answer did not come from an architect. It came from a memory. Years earlier, during a spring blizzard, Aaron had sheltered inside an east-facing sandstone pocket. Outside, fierce gusts drove needle-sharp ice at 12 degrees. Inside the cave, the air was dead still. 3 hours later, his thermometer read 45 degrees. The stone was not generating heat. It was simply refusing to change. In late August, Aaron returned with a precision mercury thermometer and placed it 90 feet inside the cave. At midday, the sunlit meadow below baked at 78 degrees. The rock interior read 46. Before dawn the next morning, when frost glazed the meadow grass at 29 degrees, the deep stone still read 46. Overhead lay tons of solid granite, balanced with the core mountain temperature. The rock was cold, but stable. It did not move, it did not draft, it simply waited. By October, his decision was finalized. The valley saw a grieving man losing his grip on reality. How could a damp, sunless hole in the cliff protect a 9-year-old child from 40 below zero when thick pine walls had failed? The answer lay in understanding the difference between heating air and storing energy. When Aaron moved the first load into the cave, he did not try to turn 18 feet of granite into a conventional house. He treated the mountain as a thermal sponge. Timber cabins leak heat because wood breathes and expands. Warm air rises and pulls freezing drafts across floorboards. The stove roars, but 80% of energy escapes up the flue. The cave operated on the inverse rule. Sandstone and granite possess enormous thermal mass. Once stone absorbs heat, it releases it outward at a slow, relentless crawl. But stone could also become a trap if ambient cold rushed inside. To solve this, Aaron established 3 strict zones: the outer windbreak, the offset entry passage, and the inner dry living cell. At the entrance, he built a low timber vestibule using peeled lodgepole pine. The doorway was barely 4 feet high, forcing anyone entering to duck low. More importantly, the exterior door and the interior opening did not align. They were offset by 6 feet. Wind hitting the mountain struck clay-packed timber, bounced sideways, and lost its velocity. Inside the vestibule hung 2 heavy curtains made from raw, greasy wool fleeces stitched together with tarred cord. Raw wool is rich in natural lanolin. Unwashed fleece sheds moisture while trapping air in millions of micro-pockets. Aaron hung 2 curtains 4 inches apart, creating a dead air airlock. The first night they tested the vestibule, the meadow outside dropped to 22 degrees. Inside the sleeping area, without a fire lit, the thermometer held at 44 degrees. Maya crawled out of her sleeping bag, smiled at her father, and unzipped her fleece vest. The wind no longer bit at their ears. Aaron recorded the temperature in his ledger and blew out the lantern. The mountain was holding. Yet down in the valley, the first warning signs of an abnormal winter were gathering, and inside Aaron's stone fortress, the very first hidden design flaw was about to strike. By the first week of November, the mild autumn vanished under a sudden northern cold snap. Temperatures across the Cabinet Range fell to 12 degrees above zero. Down in the basin, rancher Silas Boone watched his cattle bunch against willows. Boone hauled 6 cords of fur to his porch and banked dirt against his homestead logs. Passing the ridge trail on his tractor, Boone spotted Aaron hauling an antique cast iron laundry stove up the mountain on a sled. Boone cut the engine. "Aaron, you put a stove in that hole, and you'll either suffocate the girl with carbon monoxide or turn those rock walls into an ice rink from condensation." "I know," Aaron replied. He did not explain further. That night, Aaron installed the small stove 70 feet inside the cave. He ran heavy 6-inch stovepipe up through a natural fracture in the ceiling, packing the gap with fire clay, river sand, and sheet iron. He loaded the firebox with dry pinyon pine and lit the tinder. Within 45 minutes, the small iron box radiated intense heat. The soapstone slabs bolted to the sides of the stove absorbed the energy, warming the surrounding air. The cavern temperature climbed to 59 degrees. Maya sat on her wooden chest, humming as she arranged her schoolbooks on a dry stone ledge. Aaron watched the draft. Smoke rose smoothly up the pipe and exited through the cliff fissure into the night sky. At dawn, Aaron woke to a cold stillness. He walked to the entry vestibule to check the draft. He reached for the heavy wool curtain. It did not move. The bottom 4 inches of the outer raw wool curtain had frozen solidly to the stone floor. During the night, warm air hitting the freezing entry slab created runoff. Water pooled beneath the doorway and froze solid. The entryway was cemented shut. Aaron pulled hard. The coarse stitches groaned. If he tore the wool, the thermal seal was broken. If he could not open the entry quickly, their ventilation buffer was compromised. Worse, when he turned back toward the rear of the cavern, the lantern light caught a glistening reflection on the granite wall directly behind the stove. A sheet of clear moisture was running down the rock. The hot air from the unshielded stove was hitting the freezing rock face, creating massive condensation. Within 48 hours, that moisture would soak their bedding, rot their gear, and turn the air into the exact damp death trap that had killed Sarah. The mountain was rejecting their presence. Aaron stood motionless in the dim lantern light. He had 3 hours before the midday freeze locked the stone harder. How could he stop rock from sweating without losing the heat he desperately needed? Aaron did not panic. Panic wastes energy. Using a chisel and hammer, he chipped the ice collar away from the wool curtain inch by inch without tearing fiber. Once the door swung free, he removed the outer curtain entirely. He sheared 3 inches off the bottom hem, ensuring the fabric hung 2 inches clear of the floor. Next, he built a raised wooden threshold from split pine slats, anchoring it above the drainage line. Beneath the threshold, he cut a clean groove into the stone, routing melting frost out toward the downward exterior slope. Along the bottom hem of the wool, he fastened a flexible skirt of oiled latigo leather. The leather touched the floor to block drafts, but it would not absorb water or freeze to rock. Then he turned to the sweating wall behind the stove. He unbolted the stove brackets and hauled the iron unit 8 inches farther out into the center of the cavern floor. Behind the stove, he built a freestanding, dry, stacked wall using flat granite river stones. He did not mortar the stones together. He left half-inch gaps between each rock layer, creating a thermal radiator screen. When the stove fired, radiant heat struck the stone shield instead of cold cave wall. Air rose through the gaps by convection, heating both sides of the granite screen cleanly. The stone shield absorbed excess heat during the burn, storing it like a battery, while the wall behind remained dry and cool. Aaron relit the fire with dry juniper splits. By 3 in the afternoon, the stone shield was warm to the touch. Aaron ran his bare palm down the granite cave wall behind the screen. The rock was dry. Not a single bead of moisture formed. Beside him, Maya swept gravel across the walking path between the sleeping platform and the wood rack. She looked up at the doorway. "Did we fix it, Dad?" "For now," Aaron said. Down in the basin, the weather was telling a very different story. At the Blacktail Valley feed mill, Silas Boone was loading coal into a trailer. The temperature in the valley had rebounded slightly to 28 degrees, but the barometric pressure was plummeting rapidly. Frank Calloway walked out of the mill office with a clipboard, shaking his head. "Sky looks bruised to the north," Calloway remarked, leaning against the scale gate. "A Siberian high is pushing down across the border. When that hits this moisture, we're looking at 30 below before Thanksgiving." Calloway looked up toward the high ridgeline, where Aaron's cave sat hidden in the timber. "That fella up on the bluff is going to realize real fast that stone doesn't forgive mistakes," Calloway muttered. Boone tightened the strap across his coal bags. "He's got the girl with him, Frank. That's what bothers me." He made his bed. Calloway said bluntly, "When the cold gets inside that cave, he'll come dragging back down to his old cabin." Neither man realized that the old meadow cabins were about to become the most dangerous places in the county. On November 18th, the storm crossed the border and hit the Cabinet Mountains like an iron sledgehammer. It was a dry, high-velocity blizzard driven by 45-mile-per-hour northern winds. The ambient air temperature in the basin dropped from 20 degrees to minus 26 degrees in 14 hours. Down on the valley floor, the weaknesses of conventional timber construction were exposed immediately. In Silas Boone's two-story house, timbers shrank under the rapid freeze, snapping caulking lines. Wind drove snow straight through chinking under eaves. Boone loaded his stove with coal and ignited the bedroom fireplace. The heat inside the house rose to 80 degrees near the ceiling, but at floor level, a glass of water set beside the kitchen baseboard froze solid by midnight. 2 miles west, a continuous fire ignited creosote inside the Peterson chimney. Flames erupted from the roof like a blowtorch. Peterson and his sons scrambled through deep drifts, hurling snow onto the roof until the fire died. They saved the house, but the cracked flue was ruined. The Peterson family spent the rest of the night huddled in their kitchen around a kerosene heater, listening to the timbers pop in the freezing darkness. Up on the mountain bluff, Aaron's cave stood against the storm. The offset timber vestibule deflected the gale. Outside, the blizzard screamed through the stunted pines. Inside the living cell, the mercury registered 52 degrees. Maya lay in her sleeping bunk, wrapped beneath the wool blankets, reading her history chapter by the light of a brass oil lamp. Dutch lay curled under the foot of the bed, his muzzle tucked into his tail. Aaron sat on an ammo crate near the wood rack, recording fuel consumption in his ledger. A single 12-inch split of mountain juniper was keeping the stone shield radiant. Then, at 4 a.m, Dutch suddenly stood up. The dog did not bark. He walked toward the rear of the cavern, stopped near the stovepipe ascent, and whined softly. Aaron immediately set his pencil down. The flame inside the laundry stove's draft window had changed. It was no longer dancing with a crisp yellow draw. The flame was sluggish, orange, and wavering from side to side. A faint, sweet smell of warm soot hung in the air. Aaron stepped to the stove and opened the primary air intake. Instead of roaring with incoming air, the stove puffed a tiny wisp of gray smoke out through the damper seam. The draft had collapsed. Outside, violent winds formed a massive snow eddy along the cliff. A deep drift migrated over the rock shelf, burying the stovepipe exhaust cap under packed ice. The cavern was sealed. Without an active exhaust draft, carbon monoxide and smoke would fill the 90-foot stone pocket within 20 minutes. If Aaron extinguished the fire to stop the smoke, the interior temperature would drop into the sub-zero range before dawn. If he left it burning, they would never wake up. Outside, the blizzard was howling at 30 degrees below zero in absolute darkness. Aaron looked at Maya. She was watching him with wide, quiet eyes. How could a man clear an exhaust pipe buried under 5 feet of drift on a sheer rock ledge in the middle of an Arctic gale without being swept off the cliff? Aaron did not hesitate. He moved with cold, mechanical precision. He pulled on his heavy wool coat, cinched his leather belt tight around the waist, and pulled his fur-lined trapper cap over his ears. He tied a 3/4-inch manila climbing rope firmly around his chest using a double bowline knot. He carried the free end of the 50-foot rope to the base of the heavy log timber frame anchoring the sleeping platform. He secured it with 2 round turns and 2 half hitches around the primary upright. He turned to Maya. He handed her the coiled slack. "Sit on the platform with your back against the rock post," Aaron told her, his voice flat and steady. "Keep both hands on this line. If the rope goes taut, do not let go. Dutch will stay right beside you." Maya nodded once. She did not cry. She sat down, wrapped the hemp line twice around her right forearm, and planted her leather boots firmly against the stone bed frame. Aaron grabbed a short, steel-bladed coal shovel and his heavy brass hurricane lantern. He dropped to his hands and knees, pushed through the twin wool curtains, and crawled through the low vestibule. The moment he pushed past the outer leather draft flap, the storm hit him like a physical blow. The 30-below wind tore the breath from his throat, freezing moisture on his eyelashes instantly. Visibility was less than 3 feet. The swirling white vortex erased the ridge, the trees, and the valley floor into a roaring void. Working strictly by touch, Aaron hauled himself up the icy outcrop left of the cave entrance. Every foothold was slick hardpack. His mittens slipped until he jammed his shovel blade into a rock seam to pull his weight up. 5 feet above the cave mouth, he hit the drift. The wind had packed the snow into a concrete dense wall against the cliff face. The galvanized stovepipe cap was completely entombed beneath 3 feet of frozen crust. Aaron swung the short shovel with one hand, bracing his boots against the narrow ledge. His first strike glanced off hardpack. He swung again, breaking crust into jagged chunks and clearing snow away from the cowl. The moment the exhaust cleared, hot, sooty air blasted into the gale, carrying smoke away into the wind. Next, he cleared the secondary natural fissure 3 feet to the side, which fed fresh oxygen down into the cavern intake channel. He jammed a split cedar wedge into the rock mouth to prevent drifting snow from bridging across the gap again. His fingertips were throbbing with numbness. The wind chill on the exposed ridge sat near 60, below zero. Aaron turned back toward the ledge. A sudden gust caught his shoulder, throwing his center of gravity off balance. His right boot slipped on the ice. He slid 4 feet down the sloping face toward the 20-foot drop off below the entrance shelf. The manila rope snapped rigid. Inside the cavern, 30 feet away, the line jerked hard. Maya felt the impact through her arm, her boots sliding 2 inches across the gravel before locking against the timber post. She clamped her left hand over the hemp wrap and clamped her jaw shut. She did not scream. She held. Outside, tension on the chest harness caught Aaron on the lip of the rock bench. He found purchase with his left boot heel, dug his shovel point into the fissure, and hauled himself back onto the entry flat. He scrambled through the low timber opening, shoved past the double wool curtains, and collapsed onto the gravel floor inside the vestibule. He lay there for 10 seconds, his chest heaving, his beard and eyebrows coated in solid white frost. Maya was still sitting on the platform, the hemp line wrapped tightly around her arm. Deep red pressure marks showed through the cuff of her shirt where the rope had pulled against her wrist. She let out a long breath. "You cleared it, Dad." The stove started humming again. Aaron sat up. He took off his stiffened mittens and held his aching hands near the dry granite screen behind the stove. The draft was roaring clean. The air inside the room was clear, dry, and holding at 53 degrees. The lesson was etched into the rock. A cave was not a passive fortress. It was an active machine that required constant vigilance. Down in the basin, The storm was entering its second devastating phase. At the Callaway Freight Depot, 2 massive diesel supply trucks sat dead with gelled fuel lines. The town's electrical grid snapped when falling pine branches took down 3 miles of main cable along Highway 83. The families in Blacktail Valley were now entirely on their own, trapped in wooden boxes that were bleeding heat faster than their stoves could produce it. By the morning of November 22nd, the storm had entered its 4th consecutive day. The thermometer at the Blacktail Crossing weather station read 37 degrees below zero. It was the coldest sustained temperature recorded in the valley since 1836. On valley ranches, wood piles that were supposed to last through mid-January were already half empty, because logs stored outside had absorbed autumn rain before the freeze. They burned with a smoldering smoke that choked rooms while providing minimal heat. At Silas Boone's homestead, the situation had reached a crisis point. Frost had formed 2 inches thick on interior baseboards of his children's bedroom. Boone moved his 2 sons into the central kitchen, laying them on a mattress placed directly in front of the open oven door. He stood at his kitchen window, rubbing a clear circle into the heavy frost coating the glass. His eyes traveled across the frozen pasture toward the high eastern bluffs. The bluffs were silent. No smoke plumes were visible from the basin, because Aaron's stove burned seasoned mountain juniper with nearly invisible, high-efficiency heat. Boone turned back to his wife, who was wrapping their youngest son in a 3rd layer of wool blankets. "I'm going up there," Boone said. His wife looked at him with hollow, exhausted eyes. "Silas, the snow on the ridge trail is past your waist. The tractor won't start." "I'll take the heavy draft mare and snowshoes," Boone said, reaching for his canvas coat. "I have to know if that child is alive. If Aaron's fire went out 2 days ago. They're frozen in that hole." Boone saddled his Percheron mare, strapped ash snowshoes to his pack, and pushed into the blinding drifts. Every step was a battle. Cold bit through boots within 20 minutes. In steep draws, snow reached the horse's chest, forcing Boone to dismount and break trail on snowshoes with burning lungs. It took him nearly 4 hours to cover 2 miles. When he finally crested the eastern timber ridge and reached the narrow bench below the cave, he stopped. The low timber vestibule was half buried in windswept drifts, looking like an abandoned animal burrow against the mountain face. There was no sound, no movement, no tracks. Boone's heart sank into his stomach. He dropped his reins into the snow, unbuckled his snowshoes, and scrambled toward the dark opening, bracing himself for the tragedy he was certain waited inside. What Silas Boone found when he pulled aside those greasy wool curtains would permanently shatter every assumption the valley had ever held about frontier survival. Boone ducked his head, dropped to his knees, and shoved past the heavy outer leather flap of the vestibule. He brushed against the first coarse wool curtain, then the second dense fleece barrier. He pulled the inner fabric back, stepped onto the gravel floor, and stopped dead. The first thing that hit his face was not the biting chill of a tomb. It was a gentle, bone-dry wall of warm air. Boone stood up to his full 6'2" height, stunned. There was no roaring fire. The small stove held only gray-capped coals hours old, yet the chamber air was still, clean, and warm. On the raised timber platform along the southern wall, 9-year-old Maya sat cross-legged with her back against the dry granite face. She was wearing a simple cotton flannel work shirt without a coat. She had a pencil behind her ear and was sketching a blue jay in her notebook. Dutch lay on a dry sheep fleece beside the bed, lifting his head to thump his tail twice on the floorboards before resting his chin back on his paws. There was no white condensation breath hanging in the room. There was no frost on the walls. Boone's eyes darted across the space, searching for failure. He looked at the rock ceiling. It was dry. He looked at the firewood rack built against the rear wall. Every split of pine and juniper was elevated 14 inches off the floor on a slatted timber rack, bone dry and neatly stacked. He looked at the spring-fed water basin carved into the side fissure. The wooden lid was off. The water inside was liquid, clear, and perfectly still. Boone looked down at the thermometer hanging from a brass nail beside Maya's bunk. The red spirit line rested squarely at 54 degrees Fahrenheit. Outside on the exposed ridge, his horse was shivering in 37 below zero. In his own living room down in the valley, with 2 stoves burning full blast, the floor was 30 degrees. Here, in a bare stone cavity, it felt like early May. Aaron emerged from the deeper recess of the cave, carrying an iron pot of clean water. He showed no surprise at seeing Boone. He did not boast. He did not smile. He set the pot on the warm soapstone slab of the stove, nodded once, and said, "Coffee's about 10 minutes out. Silas, tie your horse under the overhang by the vestibule. There's dry pine boughs for her." Boone did not move toward the door. He walked slowly across the gravel floor, his boots crunching in the silence. He reached out his bare hand and pressed his palm flat against the freestanding granite shield behind the stove. The stone was hot. He walked around the shield and placed his hand on the actual cave bedrock 4 inches behind it. The bedrock was dry, slightly cool, but completely stable. Boone looked down at the floor, then up at the low, curved sandstone ceiling. "How?" Boone's voice came out rough, stripped of all rancher authority. "You don't have enough fire in that little stove to heat a tool shed." Aaron reached to the shelf, pulled down his surveyor ledger, and handed it to Boone. Boone flipped through the pages with stiff fingers. Column after column of numbers. Outside temp. Inside temp. Airflow rate. Firewood consumed. From November 1st through the blizzard, while Boone burned 3 cords of wood and 2 tons of coal to stay barely above freezing, Aaron burned under 3/4 of a cord. A single armload of split wood sustained the rock's thermal sponge for 6 hours. Boone closed the ledger. He looked across the room at Maya. He looked at the red-striped wool blanket smoothed neatly across her bed, the blanket Clara Vance had woven before she died in the damp logs of the valley cabin. Boone's throat tightened. He remembered the funeral. He remembered watching Aaron stand in the snow, staring at the wet cabin sills. "Does she ever wake up cold, Aaron?" Boone asked quietly. Aaron picked up a small iron poker, adjusted a single piece of juniper on the coals, and set the tool down. "No," Aaron said. "Not once." Boone stood in the warm silence of the cavern for a long time. The mountain had not broken the man. The man had simply stopped fighting the mountain and learned to use its weight. When Boone finally stepped back out into the 37 below gale, he carried something far heavier than snow on his shoulders. He carried the undeniable truth that the entire valley had been building their lives upside down. The great Arctic freeze finally broke on the 1st of December. A warm Pacific Chinook wind swept down the western slopes of the Rockies, pushing temperatures from 20 below up into the high 30s in less than 12 hours. As snow melted into slush along Blacktail Creek, the valley took inventory of damage. 4 homesteads suffered chimney fires from overdriven stoves. 3 families lost plumbing when burst pipes flooded living rooms into solid ice. At Calloway's yard, ice dams crushed eaves. On Monday morning, The porch of the Blacktail Crossing General Store was crowded with ranchers, loggers, and freight drivers. They were comparing repair bills, burned wood totals, and ruined floors. Frank Calloway sat on the tailgate of his truck, wrapping electrical tape around a split water hose. Nobody could have prepared for that, Calloway said loudly to the group. 37 below with 50-mile winds is beyond what timber is designed to handle. Nature just overwhelmed the valley. Silas Boone walked out of the store carrying a box of framing nails and a heavy roll of roofing felt. He stopped at the edge of the porch, looked Calloway dead in the eye, and set his box down. Nature didn't overwhelm Aaron Vance, Boone said clearly. The porch went completely silent. The men stopped talking. Calloway frowned. Aaron was lucky. He found a dry hole before the freeze. He didn't find luck, Frank, Boone replied, his voice cutting through the morning thaw. He measured the rock. He built an offset vestibule. He insulated with raw wool that doesn't hold water. He put 60 degrees of heat into 50 tons of stone using a handful of juniper twigs while we were shoving 20 cords of wood into houses that leaked heat like sieves. Boone stepped off the porch and threw his supplies into the bed of his truck. I was up there during the worst of it, Boone added, turning back to face the crowd. His girl was reading a book in her shirt sleeves. Not a cough. Not a shiver. He burned one cord to our 5. Nobody answered. There were no public apologies offered to Aaron Vance. In the rugged culture of the northern bluffs, apologies were not spoken. They were built. By mid-December, Silas Boone remodeled his ranch house. He built an offset timber vestibule outside his front door to trap cold air. Along his north wall, he erected a secondary interior wall lined with raw wool and riverstone. 2 weeks later, Frank Calloway was spotted at the regional supply yard buying 400 pounds of raw sheep fleeces and 2 pallets of fire clay. The knowledge spread across Blacktail Valley the way real frontier wisdom always spreads, quietly, through results rather than arguments. Nobody called them cave ideas anymore. They called them common sense. When spring finally unlocked the high draws of the Cabinet Mountains in late April, runoff rushed down Blacktail Creek in crystal-clear torrents. Up on the eastern bluff, Aaron Vance walked out onto the sunlit stone bench outside the cave entrance. Behind him, Maya carried 2 enamel cups filled with fresh spring water and set them on a flat granite rock to warm in the morning sun. Down in the valley meadow, the old log cabin still stood under the pines, its roof clearing of snow. Aaron opened the wooden tool chest near the cave mouth and looked at the 3rd enamel cup resting inside the drawer, the one with the handle turned carefully away. For the first time in 15 months, he did not turn his eyes away from it. The loss of Sarah was not gone, but the crushing weight of guilt had lifted from his chest. He had made a promise to the mountain, and the mountain had kept his daughter safe. Behind him, Maya laughed as Dutch chased a chipmunk through the melting snowdrifts on the ridge. Aaron closed the chest lid and picked up his cup. A brutal winter never bows to pride, money, or stubborn tradition. It yields only to mass, insulation, and the stoic discipline of a man who respects the laws of the wild